almost every African American who has ancestors who were slaves in America in the antebellum period has ancestry that traces back to the Maryland, Virginia area, because this area produced so many, the slave population that had such a large rate of natural increase that they were able to supply slaves to the rest of the country. And this was really crucial for the history of slavery because after 1807, the importation of slaves from overseas was illegal. Now, the importation of slaves did continue at a low level, but it was illegal and people could be punished. I mean, there was one case of a ship captain who was actually hanged for slave trading, of doing it in the period after 1807. So, therefore, there was a great incentive for the domestic production of slaves. And what we see when we read Frederick Douglass's narrative is that the fear of being sold down south, this was something that haunted every slave in the Upper South, every slave in Maryland and in Virginia, and I'd say to a lesser degree in South Carolina, although South Carolina's not the Upper South, but it was an older Southern state. There was this fear of being sold out west, that you would end up in Mississippi, you'd end up in Georgia, you'd end up in Louisiana or Arkansas, someplace like that. And so the threat of being sold is something that you see throughout the book. Now, the other thing that's really significant about the narrative of Frederick Douglass is that he talks about the living conditions. Frederick Douglass mentions that as a child, he did not have a pair of pants until he was 6 years old. He didn't have a pair of pants, let alone have any shoes. So this, as a child, he spent the winters in Maryland, and Maryland has pretty cold winters. Maryland has winters about like we get in this area. They get snow, regular snow. It gets below freezing a lot. And so just imagine being a child with no pants and no shoes for the first 6 years of your life. I mean, these are pretty rough living conditions, and they are very different from what some slaveholders talk about. Like, the book, for instance, mentions one slaveholder who always made it a point that every slave had shoes. Now, I'm not saying he didn't do that, because there were tens of thousands of people who owned slaves, and they didn't all everyone didn't treat the slaves that they controlled the same way. So I'm not saying there weren't slave masters who bought shoes for their slaves on a regular basis. But a lot of evidence suggests that they didn't. And the fact that Frederick Douglass didn't have a pair of pants was not unusual. There were people, for instance, who reported from the Ball Plantation outside of Charleston, South Carolina, that a fair amount of slaves, slaves in their early puberty, both boys and girls around the age of 12 and 13 were naked. I mean, simply did not have any clothes on at all, working in the plantations. And even in Charleston, even in the Low Country in South Carolina, it gets cold enough that you want some clothes on. Now, I don't know what time of the year they saw these slaves, but if I were in Charleston, South Carolina, other than the fact that it's illegal to be naked these days, but, if I were in Charleston, South Carolina, I'd want clothes all year long. Because in the wintertime, it gets pretty cold, and in the summertime, you got a whole lot of mosquitoes and other bugs that can bite. And being naked meant that your whole body was fair game. And so the point to be made is that when Frederick Douglass talks about not having any pants or any shoes his first 6 years of life, that was a pretty typical situation among slaves. Now, the other thing that's really significant about Frederick Douglass's book is that he talks about being both an urban and a country slave, a slave who worked in the city and a slave who worked in rural areas. Now, the thing that's really interesting about Frederick Douglass is that, he was a slave in Baltimore. And in Baltimore, his master hired him out. Basically, as a slave in Baltimore, he got the same. His master hired him out, and he got the same kind of job that a free person in Baltimore would get. And so, obviously, if you have slaves getting the same job as free people got, this created competition for free labor. And, there was resentment between free labor and slaves. Now, the interesting thing about it is that free laborers, they never seemed to get mad at slave masters. They got mad at slaves. I mean, the slaves didn't hire themselves out. So, we can argue that that's some misplaced anger there, but that seems to be a trend that we see that has existed in American history, that quite often the poor or the people who have no power a lot of times find themselves being blamed for the policies of the rich. But that's a longer theme, and, if you all take more American history, you all will run into it again. But the narrative of Frederick Douglass shows this. Now, by and large, if you were an urban slave, you had a much better life than a slave on a plantation. The work wasn't as hard, and then also you got to make money. A slave might be able to keep some of his or her earnings, and a slave who really, was industrious, might work a job and give all the job that the master hired the slave out for to the master, but then the slave could get permission to get a second job and make money that the slave could keep for him or herself. And so therefore, the conditions in the city were better. And then, also being in the city, slaves tended to have better clothes. They tended to have shoes. They tended to have pants. And so there was just a better quality of life. Now, also in the case of Frederick Douglass, what we see is that early on, when he ends up in the city, because, he starts off in the countryside, and then he ends up being sent to relatives of a master in the city after that master dies. This is when he first gets his education. The wife of his master in Baltimore likes him. He's a boy, and she starts teaching him how to read. Now, when her husband finds out, he makes her stop, saying, look, you cannot teach a slave how to read. Of course, the whole notion is that a literate slave would have enough education to question his situation or her situation. Might even find the law or whatever and try to get freedom. And, and of course, that's what Frederick Douglass does. As Frederick Douglass, although his initial mistress stops teaching him how to read, he's learned a little bit. And what Frederick Douglass would do is that he would pay white schoolboys to teach him to read some more. Because these boys quite often didn't have a lot of money. Frederick Douglass was working. He had money. And so he could pay these boys money, or he could give them bread so they could eat more. And they would teach him how to read. And so through his own initiative, Frederick Douglass was able to become literate after his initial master, Mr. Stops. Now, Frederick Douglass, of course, ends up back in the countryside again. And he's a pretty hard-headed slave. And so eventually Frederick Douglass gets sent to a slave breaker. Now, if you remember in the book, in chapter 9, when they talk about yeoman farmers or free whites in the South, one of the jobs that free whites could get would be to be an overseer, the person who was in charge of making slaves work on a plantation. And another job that they could get would be to be a slave breaker. Now, these were people whose job it were to break the will of slaves who did not want to conform to the discipline of being on a slave plantation. Now, the interesting thing about Frederick Douglass, according to his story, is that the slave breaker doesn't break him. Eventually, he ends up in a fight with the slave breaker, and he beats the slave breaker. Now, it just so happens that they fight in private. Nobody sees the fight. But, after the slave breaker realized he can't beat Frederick Douglass, he basically says, look, he pretty much says it's a draw. And he also acts like he won, but he never hits Frederick Douglass again. He's never roughed to Frederick Douglass again, because he knows he can't beat him. Now, the interesting thing about this, now, if this had happened in front of other whites, or if this had happened in front of other slaves, the slave breaker might have killed Frederick Douglass. He might have shot him, or, even though that would have been something that Frederick Douglass's master would not have liked, because as a slave, Frederick Douglass was valuable property. And, killing a slave would be like taking a $100,000 or $500,000 combine and blowing it up. Even if you didn't like the combine, you could sell it and make money. And so the thing to understand is that although slavery was brutal, there was incentive not to kill slaves because slaves were worth money. But anyway, to get back to the narrative itself, Frederick Douglass was able to, from his force of will and the fact that he was a strapping young man who didn't mind fighting his slave driver, he's able to come out of this, even though he was a slave. He was able to somewhat dictate the terms of his life, that, he was able to fight off the slave driver, and he was able to be treated pretty well. Now, eventually, of course, Frederick Douglass escapes from slavery. Now, he never says how he escapes from slavery, and, there's a good reason for this, because if he had told how he escaped from slavery, then the method that he used would be a method that would not be available to other slaves who might want to escape. And also, if he had told how he escaped from slavery, he could very well have gotten both slave and free people in trouble. And so I can understand why he did not share his secret of how he was able to gain his freedom. But the point to be made is that Frederick Douglass did become free. He was able to move to New York State. He was able to marry a woman who was already free, that he liked. And he was able to establish himself as a free man in New York. And he was able to become a major abolitionist. Now, the question that I ask you about this book is that, to what degree is this book a polemic? And a polemic is a book or a pamphlet that's really written to push a particular argument, sometimes in a fairly extreme form. I mean, a good example of another historical polemic would be Common Sense by by one of the founding fathers, Thomas Paine. This was a book that he wrote that really made the argument for America to get its independence. There have been a number of famous polemics in history. You can make the argument that, say, for instance, like the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx, written in 1848, just a few years after the narrative of Frederick Douglass. Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass was a great polemic criticizing early capitalists and arguing that conditions of work for laborers in Europe in particular should be improved, and if revolution was necessary, then that was justifiable. And so, in my opinion, and like I said, you all don't have to write what I say. When I ask you to answer a question, I want you to give your opinion, and I don't want you just to repeat what I say. But I would argue that, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass does function quite well as a polemic, because he really does argue to his point well. But at the same time, I would argue that it also is very important as a historical document, because Frederick Douglass is a slave. He's the rare slave who is able to write, and he's the rare slave who is able to actually publish his story and put it out for the public. So, a lot of what we understand about the conditions of slavery, especially in Maryland, a lot of that really is based on what Frederick Douglass shared. And so I'd argue that, from my standpoint, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass it functions both as a polemic and as a historical document. Now, how you all want to describe that, what you decide to emphasize more than the other or whatever, that's on you. You look at the evidence, you can look at the book, you can look at the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, and how you come down on that argument is you. That's your decision, just to have the evidence to back up what you say. Anyway, I hope that these two lectures, I ended up making two lectures because I accidentally cut myself off, are helpful to you. Take care.